What up, everybody? Welcome to episode 4 of the Comrades Classroom Podcast, part 1 of our Disability Justice series. On it, myself and Sham sit down at neighbor school with our homies from Sacramento and talk about how we imagine implementing disability justice practices in our communities. Listen, discuss, share with friends, and most importantly, for everybody, but especially if you're white, don't consume this labor for free. Donate to us on Venmo at The People's Coalition, or become a sustainer of our mutual aid work on patreon.com/thepeoplesfund. That's patreon.com/thepeoplesfund. And we'll have that linked in the episode description as well. If you have any questions or you want to get involved, hit us up on Instagram. And as always, we appreciate every one of y'all's support and hope you enjoy.
Feed for you. Walk across the moat and love will be the seed for you. I don't know why I do what I do for you, yeah. But I know it's such a thing as too loyal, yeah. And I know my memory is getting shorter by the minute. Tipping over bottles every second that I finish. The mirror keeps telling me shit I don't wanna hear. I seen the brasserie and shed a tear. Am I home? Am I the only one away? Yeah. And if not, how long am I to wait? Yeah. Heaven's gates, the list don't got my name, yeah. But that's okay. Shit's boring anyway.
Yeah, so just briefly for the agenda, we're just going to talk about who we are at the People's Coalition. And again, that's not defined by two people. We're just two small parts of it. We got about 35 folks who are actively working on our different survival programs. So that's key, right? Is that it's not, there's no leadership, there's no bosses, there's no teachers. Or not no teachers, but the role of the typical, it's everybody working in reciprocity with each other. We'll talk a little bit about understanding our own positionality, like why the fuck am I sitting here talking to you about disability justice? Why is Sam sitting here talking to you about disability justice, and kind of understanding where we fit into that. I think that kind of comes from that one bullet point from the community agreements, right? Where it's understanding where and when to speak up and when's your time, right? And I think it's being really aware of the topics we're speaking on and who we're speaking on them to. We'll go through a couple key vocabulary, just 3 for this. We'll have a quick video break of for us the GOAT of disability justice, Elliot Fukui. The way they break down these concepts is just next level for a lot of us. And we'll turn y'all by the end to our Comrades Classroom page, which has the month of December is all disability justice resources, and that shit is fire. And the last thing we'll talk about is actually implementing models within our interpersonal lives, within our community spaces, within our organizational spaces, right? That actually embody collective care models that actually embody healing justice and disability justice and whatnot. And if we get distracted at all during this, it's because of capitalism, and Sam is working right now.
Yeah, sorry.
And so we know how that goes. Yeah, you can go to the next one. Points of unity. You want to start?
Yeah. So we are anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist.
We struggle for the defense and livelihood of Native peoples and lands and work to challenge the existence and domination of colonial nation states.
We center the political struggle of Black, Indigenous, and trans feminism.
We believe in the radical unity of all colonized people via these different political lenses. We believe in the people's right to self-determination and self-defense.
We are anti-patriarchal and anti-white supremacy.
And this last one is kind of the ongoing, I think, struggle for all of us, that the challenge we need to all take, right? And constantly killing the capitalist and the cop that sits and lives in our head and has us projecting all of these capitalist ideologies and settler ideology each other, on ourselves, on our communities, on other folks, right? So it's believing in the abolition of all symptoms of settler colonialism, right? So not just the systems, not just the military industrial complex, not just the prison industrial complex, not just white supremacy, right? But the symptoms that come from that type of violence, right? So that means settler colonialism, that means capitalism, that means heteropatriarchy, that means ableism, that means white supremacy, that means whorephobia, that means fat phobia, right? That means all of these isms and phobias that violently impact the experiences of our siblings and our most vulnerable siblings. And there's never a point where you're like done, right? There's never a point where you have abolished these symptoms from you. Like we were raised in the heart of of global imperialism. Like we were raised in the heart of global imperialism. We need to like realize that and really like come face to face with that and understand that we're not gonna like tomorrow just not be ableist. We're not gonna just tomorrow. I'm not just gonna not be patriarchal. It's never gonna happen. It's about this constant process of undoing that violence that we were taught for so many years. You can go past this. It's not really that important.
So why are we the ones talking to you about this? So hello, I'm Sam. I'm disabled and chronically ill, which is why I choose to speak on this particularly. Disability justice is new for me, but also not new because I've always been disabled. I've just never used the word because I was never given the vocabulary. I found that out last year, and it's been like life-changing actually to not have to perform ableism. Which is really nice.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was Felisa, I just sent a different link. I updated the ones I sent to Jordan just a little bit, but just while we're talking on this part, we can switch them over, if that's okay. I don't mean to cause you any trouble. Yeah. So why are we the ones talking about this? So Sam shared, right, as a disabled person, right, within this space on the authority to talk about this. But why does somebody like me, a non-disabled or able-bodied, have really any authority to talk on this? And Alice Wong kind of situates this for us where it's about it's the fact that we can't only put this labor on disabled folks, right? And it's the fact that we can't just depend on the labor, especially it's been for years free labor, right, of disabled folks to create our spaces that are safe for them, right? It's up to us. It's up to non-disabled and able-bodied folks to transform the spaces, because most spaces in society are inaccessible to our disabled siblings, to our immunocompromised siblings, to our mentally ill siblings, right? And so to actually build spaces for them is not up to them, right? It's up to us. And so that's why I think Alice Wong puts so much pressure on non-disabled folks to be the ones talking about this, to be the ones stepping back into their spaces, being like, yo, what the fuck is this? Like, even if there's no direct disabled folks in your community, it's the least you can do out of an act of love is to provide access at bare minimum to your space, right? But especially having actual disabled folks in your space is the most important. You can go to the next one. Thank you. So key vocabulary. You want to start with this one?
Yes. So disability justice. It's a vision and practice of a yet to be, a map that we can create with our ancestors and our great grandchildren onward in the width and depth of our multiplicities and histories, a movement towards a world in which every body and mind is known as beautiful.
Yeah, and I mean I love that definition because again it acknowledges the historical and ancestral presence that is necessary for this to occur, but also, right, is that this path onward that is continuing, and the multiplicity of that path between individuals, and really recognizing, right, every individual body and mind, but amongst the collective. Healing justice. This is my favorite definition. I know a lot of people talk about like transformative justice and RJ, but I think healing, like this definition of healing justice, kind of expands both of them. So it's a framework that identifies how we can holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and to bring collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on our bodies, hearts, and minds, right? So it's like, I think we get stuck in this argument of like, oh, I'm a TJ practitioner, or I'm an RJ practitioner, or I use this practice, I use these practices. Whereas like a healing justice framework is like just focused on the different collective practices that can bring healing to communities, right? And really figuring out ways to holistically respond to violence, to harm that folks experience. Either on a very violent scale, or a less violent scale, right? But right, it's an understanding that this violence is a spectrum, and that responding to it can't just be like never one situation is going to be the same when we're talking about addressing harm or trauma. And then the last one is decolonization. You want to read that one?
Yeah. The action and practice of dismantling harmful structures of power, reclaiming previous subjectivities, and envisioning of a future built on previous and current understandings of compassion, relation, and accountability.
And we threw this in here as a key vocab because, like Jordan kind of joked earlier, right, about the need for him personally to go back to Africa, or for African people, right, to understand what a Pan-African movement really looks like. But all of that, right, any of these goals that we have or aspirations can't happen without decolonization, without the complete destruction of the settler state, right? Whether that's a settler a Zionist state that puts extreme violence on Palestinian people and has always, or we're talking about the American settler state, or in the way in which that the American imperialism imposes its settler nature on, right, South America, on Africa, on East Asia, on Southeast Asia. It's understanding imperialism and settler colonialism from an internationalist standpoint, and understanding that we can't reach any of these goals without the complete decolonization, right? Without turning the land and the power back to the people who it belongs to. I mean, I could say a lot about that, but I'm not gonna. So, yeah, just the need to understand that we can't just be democratic socialists and like go be like, yay, go DSA, because the DSA believes in just like environmental imperialism, right? Like it's just a little better imperialism. And I mean, we know that's why Elon Musk is now the richest motherfucker in the world because of the DSA. So in the Green New Deal, right? So it's being critical about our goals and aspirations as revolutionaries. Yeah, you can play. You can play on this. I'll just shut up. Elliot's way better.
So disability justice is a term that was coined by Patty Byrne and the Disability Justice Collective, which was this amazing crew of disabled, badass, mostly queer and trans people of color. Disability justice is really looking at creating a world where every body, every mind, regardless of how it's shaped or moves or functions in the world, has a place and understands that disabled folks have a lot to offer to our communities. And in the same vein, it's grounded in the agency and self-determination of a person who identifies, like I identify as neurodivergent, that my agency and self-determination is prioritized over, right, things like the medical industrial complex or saying that there's something wrong with me. Transformative justice is also about agency and self-determination, right? And people have understanding that we are all empowered to change our lives and to change behaviors and to transform the culture that we live in. Disability justice is also trying to transform the culture that we live in to be, bigger and allow for more agency and self-determination from more of us. So that intersection is a super sweet spot because, yeah, we're all fighting for that same thing, which is that we get to exist in the world without fear of harm just because of who we are or how we move through the world. As someone with who's neurodivergent and with disabilities, like a lot of how I entered into this work was through my own lived experience of trying to be accountable to my community and be able to show up for my community as someone who, very frequently has to take moves back because of how my mind and my body function. But also for care to become a collective thing. Disabled folks, we've never been able to rely on a lot of the systems that are in place, or those systems have been incredibly harmful to us. More than 50% of people who are murdered by the police are people with neurodivergence or who are neuroatypical or have cognitive disabilities, right? So for a disabled community, this is also about us staying alive. I think everyone should have a safety team. Everyone should have a community that loves them enough and unconditionally. Having a safety team has enabled me to be outside, to be a part of my community, and it also is a preventative tool. My friends know how to support me and take care of me so that I don't end up outside while I'm dissociated or episodic, which means I have less interactions with police officers, which means I have a lesser chance of ending up back inside or really harmed by the state or the system. So when I think about transformative justice and community accountability, and again, that intersection, right, is like, this is really about going back to what we know is true, that our relationships are the most valuable resource that we have in maintaining our agency and self-determination, in getting the love and care and support we need to survive, and in shifting our culture kind of from the inside out.
From a disability perspective, so many of us who are disabled live in a lot of isolation because of ableism. So, and I mean, that can happen for people who aren't disabled too. I think that's true for a lot of survivors and a lot of people, that they're like, what community? So I guess I also want to give a shout out, because I think, community is a word in community accountability, right? And I think often there is still this focus we have on oh my God, this great network of community is going to be there, and it's so wonderful. And a lot of us actually have a much more mixed experience, or we're actually, we're loners, we're hermits, there's a lot of stuff that we don't actually have support around, or we're actually kind of isolated. And I guess I kind of want to give a shout out to people who might be watching this video who are living alone in their apartments or their lives, who are still building lives that have safety, peace, justice, and healing, and to say that that's real too.
So real quick, we're going to talk about that last person who spoke. So we're going to the first person was Elliot, who we're going to use the majority of the rest of the time to talk about his care team model, which he kind of mentioned a little bit, right, about his safety team. But briefly, so Leah wrote this book and has this amazing paper called Cripping Transformative Justice. And yeah, Sam's going to talk a little bit about that, and we'll expand on it a little bit.
Yeah. So the author discusses how many TJ practitioners are both disabled and have experienced harm or trauma through a number of intersections, and how ableism is often intertwined with survivor hatred. And that's it's really common. It's common for your TJ practitioner to be neurodivergent. These things are normalized in this space, but outside of this space, it's still such an impactful thing, because people see it as so differently. They see only how ableism works in that way, when really it's several different ways that ableism is causing people to receive harm, even unintentionally, from able-bodied folks, just because of how much pressure is put on TJ practitioners as well. And that's what they really talk about in their book. It's about how they have to learn, as disabled folks, you have to learn how to protect yourself from all of the things that you want to help do. And that's really where able-bodied folks come in and start to take off that pressure, and to really help disabled folks in a way that is reciprocal and not just taking and or giving. It's actually a very detailed relationship, and we'll talk about that in the care team models. She also discusses how always being considered too much by her, which is really common for disabled chronically ill folks, and her peers viewed her access as a burden instead of a reciprocal act of love. So when we think about access, we think about now, having captioning.
Building one ramp to go into a store.
Building a ledge on a sidewalk, because you can't just have it all the same, because wheelchairs exist, and also people who cannot take steps exist. It's also about captioning. It's about describing your pictures and your photos so that people who are hard of seeing or blind can also access whatever you're putting out, because if it's not reciprocal, if it's not completely accessible by most disabled folks, then it's not worth putting out. And that's not to shame able-bodied folks, but to remind them that the things that you take as normalcy are things that are inaccessible to people. You're in the same way that we all try to make sure that everybody has access to things, but we forget sometimes that our pictures aren't captioned because we're not blind. We forget that even something as simple as shows on TV being captioned for the blind and deaf, how those things can go unseen by a lot of able-bodied folks. And it's very common, and it's disheartening for a lot of reasons. Sorry, I was also just reading a thread on this, so it's very poignant, but it's not a problem that I face, but it's a problem that a multitude of people face. You want to do the last one?
Yeah, but to kind of expand on that though, right? It's like there's a couple of things I'm thinking of, right? Because it isn't just about, right, the things that are visible to you, right? Not everybody's disabilities are visible, and I think that's super important too, right? Because it's not just about being like, okay, I see this disability, now I know that this disability is in front of me, and now I'm going to provide them access, right? It's transforming the conditions of our society. It's transforming our spaces. It's transforming everything we do, so that it's not a second thought. So that it's not oh shit, now we have to provide access. This is a burden. Like, oh, now we have to go and do this. It's always considering every person that you want to have access to your space, right? Which should be everybody within our community. So it's really not only having a piece of every person in your community that has a voice within your collective, but also understanding the needs and the people within your community and knowing how to provide access for them.
Was it Elliot that said disability justice benefits able folks just as much as disabled?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that same idea that like the destruction of capitalism and white supremacy will also benefit white folks. It's not just colonized people. Obviously, it creates more violence and will benefit them greater when it's gone. But like white folks are also unhoused, and white folks are also suffer from the prison industry and certain complexes. And it's not to sympathize with the settler at all. It's to understand that like the destruction of these systems will benefit literally every single person. And then the key quote that we did, that we put up on the flyer, that Jordan asked us to talk about earlier, was, we need to talk about liberation from a disability justice perspective that believes our exhaustion and vicarious trauma are not sidelines to the struggle. We need to take a breath and dare to imagine models for doing this work that are actually sustainable. And that speaks a lot, I think, to what I was just saying, because like specifically like for Sam, for example, like their access to the space is us being very well planned. It's us having grace. It's us being in strong communication and being able to pick up labor when their lung function is below 40%, when they don't have any spoons left and like genuinely can't get out of bed, right? But like made promises to the community that they were going to help get food somewhere, but like they woke up the next day and are like unable to move, right? And unable to physically function. So then it's up to us as their community, as a part of their collective care team, to pick up that labor, right? And make sure that even though they're struggling and don't have access in the moment to do the labor that they promised, that labor still gets picked up and still gets done. And it's not seen as a burden. It's not seen as a distressor or causing more pain, right, to Sam, but it's just like making sure that those structures are built into our framework and our day-to-day lives, so that if there is a flare-up with their chronic illness or their disability, we can address it. Both interpersonally in our relationship, and then also the collective can make sure that they're supporting us as well. I don't know, did that sound right? Or
no, that's completely right. And it's really necessary, not only for like your disabled folks who are like physically disabled or chronically ill, but also for neurodivergent folks. We often forget that neurodivergence isn't genuinely accepted in society, and that it's like, and that every day we are forcing ourselves to perform ableism by not having our ADHD or our anxiety or any depression or like these things met, schizophrenia, like any of these things, bipolar disorder, and how varying those things can be day to day. We often think about like getting things done and then worrying about our self-care, but like when we have this care team model, this disability justice lens over everything, it makes it so much easier to look at your friend who may be able-bodied but is having a depressive episode and be able to let them also take the time and have the grace to sit down and deal with their emotions, or not come to distro that day because they signed up a week ago, but like now it's the day and it's really hard. And that can even be like when we're at distro, or like when
they talk about in the thing in the reading Cripping TJ that Leah wrote, how like in spaces you can have a mad episode, you can have a schizophrenic episode, you can go manic, you can break down and cry and have an anxiety attack, like in the organizing space, in a meeting, in class. And nothing changes. Nothing about the space changes, right? They allow that space for you to take the space that you need, and they continue on with their day. It's not everyone in the room, all 50 people coming and surrounding that one person and freaking out, be like, oh my God, how can we help you? How can we do this? And like glorifying or victimizing their disability. It's addressing it with care and based off of their agency and their self-determination. What do they need in that moment, right? And so like, you don't know that if you haven't had those conversations already as a collective or as a group, right? When those things come up. And so like, we've had baby anarchists all throughout the presentation, right? But love is holding space for each other. And I think that's really key with disability justice and collective care frameworks. Is calling your homies out to address the harm they've done, right? Whether that's like the type of violence we typically talk about with harm, right? Or not providing access is harm, right? Not acknowledging certain folks with disabilities or not recognizing it is harm. Creating a certain space where the folks didn't even feel comfortable bringing up their disability, that's harm, right? So it's addressing that within your collective and really, really working through that. And the shit is hard. Like I promise you, the shit is really hard. It's like 2-3 hour meetings with the homies, with like maybe just the 11 people that are in here, or just the 10 people that you distro with, or maybe it's a 50 person collective, right? But it's really having those difficult conversations and understanding the needs of each person. Because it's like, it's vital. It's really vital to our survival. You can go to the next slide. And so now we're just gonna break down, and what do we got? We got about 15 minutes. So we'll try to do this in like 10 minutes so we can leave some space at the end.
And y'all could go over time a little bit too. Like don't press on like gotta be done in 7.
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate that. So yeah, we'll just go through this quickly. Because really, like, this is Elliot's model, and I think that if you really want to get a good idea of this, you should go and watch. It's about an hour-long teaching that they did similar, and I will go watch that, and I can drop the link at the end. But we'll rip through this. So you want to alternate, or do you want me to?
Can you start?
Yeah. So what is a care team, right? So it's a group of people who are creating and participating in a process of mutual aid grounded in agency and consent to support one another and prevent harm, right? So this model is created for disabled folks, is for mentally ill folks, for neurodivergent folks, or for people who've experienced harm, to be able to address those things, their needs on a day-to-day basis. Right. And so everyone who's involved in that, it needs to be understood, right, that it's mutual aid. It's about agency and consent, and it's about supporting one another, right? It's not transactional. It's not one person only getting their needs met. It's not about one person doing this or the entire collective, right, and their reciprocal acts towards each other.
Who are in alignment about communication, decision-making, their roles during times of support and crisis, proactive, rapid response. And this seems so basic, but communication is so hard. And like, as much as we think we may have open lines of communication, there's so many factors that we have to constantly reopen the space and reopen those connections, because things happen, harm occurs, and people hold things in. And this is just the way we were taught. This is the way society raised us. But breaking down these walls and continuing to open those lines of communication with like honest, very blunt conversation is so necessary. And like, we see that every day.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. If and I'm just gonna use neighbor programs as an example. If you got 10 people that are gonna go do a distro for our unhoused siblings, right? You need to know what the decision-making processes even are gonna be, right, to get that distro done. You need to know what roles need to be had, right, to get that distro done. And then if there's crisis or an emergency during that distro, right, cops pull up, sweeps are happening, whatever it is, right, it's being able to respond to that, right? So it's really just doing the shit we already do, but like having these proactive conversations about it, both with our interpersonal relationships, having it with ourselves, having it with our collective of folks, right? And it's knowing the decisions that have to be made and the roles that need to be taken up for either someone's need to be met or for a task to get done. A group of people who are willing to try different strategies in order to minimize impact to someone who's in an emotional crisis and minimize burnout for people who are in supportive roles.
Who are willing to practice being accountable to and for themselves and to each other.
Yep, and accountability is key, right? And I think the most key, which y'all probably talked about in other spaces, right, is that the person being held accountable has to want it at the end of the day, right? The folks who are looking for healing and growth cannot be the ones taking on the labor to hold that person accountable, right? That you have to want to be held accountable. You have to pursue accountability. It can't just be put on you by other people who care about you. And then lastly, care team is a group of people who are willing to practice resource sharing and or wealth redistribution, and that is super key, right? If you have a collective of 35 folks and you're meeting the needs of the community around you, and an emergency comes up within that collective of 35, and you can't even meet those needs, right? Then we're failing at some rate, right? So if our own homies who are trying to do this work are having a mental episode, are experiencing physical trauma, are experiencing a need or lack of shelter or need for money, right? It's being able to have that collective that's already in place who can go and meet those needs. So think about mutual aid for ourselves as well, not just for the people we're going out and providing resources for. You can go to the next slide. Go ahead.
So some guiding questions are, what are some of the barriers I face to asking for and receiving support?
What does my day-to-day capacity look like?
What are the ways that feel safest for me to ask for support?
What are some of the ways I like to receive support?
What are the ways that I love to offer support?
How do I like to give and receive feedback?
What places and spaces feel safest to me when I'm not well?
And what are my goals for being a part of a care team? So I know when we had this discussion with our group, like we got stuck on this page for like an hour.
Yeah.
Right. And so like these are like tough questions. Like, so I really challenge, or we really challenge everybody like in here tonight. And if you take this model and go talk about it in a larger collective, to like almost like assign these questions beforehand or after, and like talk about it again and meet together, because like these are, it's understanding your own capacity. Like, how often can I actually even show up and be my full self in that space, right? Because if you're not honest about that, then you're going to cause harm to everybody else, right? If you don't have capacity, but you're trying to act like you do, right? That's not good for anybody involved. And so being able to actually answer these questions and talk through them is super hard, but like necessary. Yeah.
It's also so vital, because like for your neurodivergent disabled folks, capacity looks hella different all the time. Receiving support looks different all the time. Receiving feedback looks different all the time. And like reassuring your folks that like you're willing to change as they change, and you're willing to work with how they show up when they show up is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think, and for the feedback one, for me, I always go to that one because I think you can say how you want to receive feedback. You could say whatever, but like when the time comes, and I always use like Sam and I as an example, right? When actually be held accountable, when someone's like actually telling their honesty. So like, say Sam and I are having a disagreement, right? Or I personally did something that wasn't considerate of their needs, especially as a disabled person. And when the time comes for me to actually receive that feedback, I didn't even receive it the way that I said that I was going to. I was like, oh, of course I'm gonna like hold myself accountable. But like my first thing was to be defensive, right? First thing was to be defensive. So it's about actually in the moment as well, like having a better understanding of like, why is this making me feel uncomfortable? Why is this making me angry? Why is this making me anxious? Why is this whatever? And like asking yourself those questions instead of projecting behaviors, especially negative behaviors, onto other folks, right? Because it's probably not them trying to cause harm to you. It's probably you projecting certain feelings onto them. Yeah, so we can go to the next one.
So the kinds of people we need in our spaces: people with boundaries.
People, which is super key. What we talk about, one simple thing is just talking all the time, being super overt about your actions. Like, so literally just like, can I give you a hug? Like, it's like not that hard to ask that every time, because sometimes someone's gonna say yes, sometimes they might say no. And so it's having conversations about boundaries. People who I feel seen and heard by.
People who bring me joy and comfort.
People I identify as comrades.
People who I have seen handle crisis.
People who I've struggled with or alongside.
People who are grounded in shared principles and values.
Right, which is why we love that, right? The neighbor school starts with, right, their version of the 10-point program, right? We started with our points of unity, right? So you can't even be in community together if there's not like a shared principles and values that you're working towards or with.
You're already being held accountable from the jump. People who honor consent, and like going back to the hugging thing, like that's very basic. We think consent is basic, but like we got to remember that like physical touch is physical touch regardless of how we go about it. So
You don't know
even,
everybody's triggers.
yeah, so even like a hand on the shoulder can be too much for people at certain points, and sometimes a full-on bear hug is what they want. And being able to be flexible with your comrades like that is creates dynamics of such openness and an ability to share information that like it's so basic, but we have to make it intentional.
People who are aware of power dynamics, right? So understanding that I, like for example, that I am a man, I am able-bodied, I am mass presenting, right? Even if I identify as non-binary, right? None of that. So obviously it matters, right? But the power dynamics are still there, regardless. So it's super key to identify those.
People who are accessible to me.
Yeah, people with different skills, identities, wisdom, and lived experiences, right? If everybody's from the same cookie cutter, right? It's not that doesn't breed growth or healing or diversity or none of that, right? So it's actually having a space of people with different skills, identities, wisdoms, and lived experiences.
People who are willing to take risks and learn from their mistakes. Also, people who are willing to own up to their mistakes. We talk about like these things are basic accountabilities. When you make a mistake or if you take a risk and it goes bad, you have to be able to be accessible and able to be held accountable. And as much as we say that we want to, and we say that we will, we have to actively work towards that, intentionally still call those things out within each other because it's so easy to let them go.
Yeah, I always read through this one and look at it as like as something as a person who you want to strive to be, right, or like work towards. Because the way I look at it, right, if I'm out in the field, if I'm doing a grocery pop up in the neighborhoods, if I'm doing distributions with the unhoused homies, if I look around and I see these type of people beside me, day in and day out, like my experience in that is gonna be so much better, right? It's just gonna be so much better. You're gonna be safer. You're gonna be more comfortable. You're gonna have more access, and then you're also gonna have motherfuckers who are gonna ride or die for you, like straight up, right? And so it's understanding that um, like these frameworks are always seen as like soft or like or as a burden, but really they provide so much strength and support, and really adopt different models that our communities have already used, right, in gang culture, right, in a lot of different things. So it's just viewing it differently, I think, too. Um, you can go to the next one. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this one's a little less applicable, but right, if you're someone um, who is a survivor, who is disabled, who needs a direct care team around you, right, of like 5 or 6 friends, then like this part is super important. But we talk about this a lot. If we're talking about it on a more of a collective scale, is really talking with each other about the different types of roles with the informations and tasks within your specific collective. But in this model, we can talk about it as well.
Do we say?
Yeah.
So, internal communicator, person who coordinates communication within the team. Power of attorney / proxy, persons like people who are decision makers for emergencies. This is obviously for disabled folks who are medically not stable, but also it's hella important to like remember that like life is short and these things do happen. So like to keep even as able-bodied folks to keep these things in mind. Shit comes at you fast.
Yeah, support people who show up in the ways requested.
Advocates, people who attend appointments, support with navigating systems and institutions. Important. It's very hard to ask for help. Personally, for me, as a disabled folk, I don't like having to ask for help, but unfortunately, because of the heteropatriarchy within all of our systems, even medical, having a male mask presenting folk in the room with me or having them talk for me usually goes better, unfortunately. That sounds the shittiest because it is. And although I don't use that very often, there have been times when I have not been stable enough to get through an appointment by myself, and I've had to use those things, or like I used my mother for when I was younger. But it's hard not being able to advocate for yourself. And so if someone were to ask for this, or you needed this in your group, know that it comes with responsibility, but also a lot of vulnerability from the person asking for help, because it's not easy to do that. And it's not easy to navigate these things.
And then logistics, a person who coordinates scheduling, food deliveries, finances, etc. And again, right, it's just like understanding that this model, right, even specifically for one person with a disability and their close group, their safety team, or right, a larger collective, right? So you need to have all of these things nailed down. Everyone needs to know where they fit in, what skills they can provide, how they can show up to the group meaningfully, right? And it's not saying that you have to meet this criteria to be a part of the group. It's also providing access in that way and allowing people to show up how they can, right? Port one, there's literally just people who show up in the ways requested for that person. So literally, if Sam's just like, or the person, whoever is just like, I want to go get ice cream, right, in their care team, and if someone responds like, for sure, I'm down, and they grab you and you go get ice cream, right? Like it literally, like it can be that simple. Elliot talks about it in that way. Like it's, I think we think that TJ and disability justice like really fucking hard, but like that's able-bodied people saying that shit. Like disabled folks have had to struggle and deal with this shit their whole lives. So like just like providing support and care for somebody is like the easiest shit. And I think we have to view it through that lens as well. And we can go to the next one.
Communication strategies, honesty about capacity, and that's on everyone's part, even able-bodied folks, because like burnout is burnout, and that shit comes and it hits hard and it sucks.
Yeah, that's something we haven't talked about, right? Is like it's understood that like the able-bodied activist, right, is like a fucking superhero, right? You don't have any flaws. You don't get tired. You show up all the fucking time. You read like 8,000 pages a day, like blah, 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 blah. Like that's all bullshit, right? It's not, and it's not sustainable. If you do it, you're not going to be able to do that your whole life. So it's being super honest, even as able-bodied folks, being like, what are these unrealistic fucking standards that are being put upon us, right? By capitalism. Like why is the overproduction this thing that is expected? So it's like, I don't think we've talked about enough in this like right now, but this isn't just for disabled folks. This is understanding that these unrealistic pressures of production are also put on able-bodied folks. And if we've seen, right, a number of movements fail, right? We've seen this shit happen throughout history, and a lot of it is due to the inability to address capacity, and then the inability, right, to actually like stay true to the values, right, and not get infiltrated, right, by fucking feds. Anyway, go ahead.
Also, it's also the inability for able folks to admit that they have a capacity,
Yep.
that they are not invincible, that they are not 100 times better than disabled folks because they can stay up 24 hours, but like also burn out within like 2 hours
that
after
you do
that.
experience emotional and physical pain as well.
Yeah, it's knowing your limitations and meeting folks where they're at is the next point. And it's so true, because sometimes as an able-bodied folk, like you're still at like 10% because the semester has worn you out and you're working 2 jobs and like that shit sucks. And like being honest about that and not pretending that you're like okay just because that's what society wants from you.
Yeah, honest and timely feedback is super key if you're gonna continue to build and grow these relationships. Space to address dynamics and offer feedback is super important. If folks are feeling a certain type of way and that never gets communicated, we have to understand that that's only going to create toxic environments and different types of harm.
And if one person's feeling it, there's so likely that another person is feeling it and like 10 other people are feeling it. So just address it. And on top of that, doing joyful things together, not just work. You gotta have to also have just basic interaction of relationship that's like stable and kind and reciprocal.
Yeah, like the work has to get done. Again, if using the neighbor program as an example, obviously you have to get that distro finished. Bro, who says you can't kick back and smoke a blunt and drink some wine with their homies afterward, right? Like you have to also enjoy the revolutionary like love that you're experiencing with one another. Documentation is critical, very fucking critical, right? Especially whether good things happen or bad things happen. If it's not documented, right? We've seen fucking smear campaigns. We've seen toxic environments. We've seen just fucking lies, like tear down entire organizations, right? We've seen, I don't know how familiar y'all are, but like we've seen the slander, like, and the multiple attempts to tear down like People's Breakfast Oakland, for example. Right? So it's understanding that like document this shit and keep your ass covered in like a number of ways, right? Because if you're documenting your conversations within your collective, then you're also able to hold each other accountable more. Because like, no, like we talked about this, you said you were going to do this, you said this is how we were going to address this type of conflict, and now you're saying this. So like explain that, right? And if you don't have that documented, if you're not actually talking through these things, then no one can actually be held accountable.
The next is grounded in self-determination and mindfulness. The self-determination is so important because in order to want to fulfill the needs of your community and have like collective determination, you have to have self-determination. And the mindfulness is also so key because you need to be able to stop and look at what you're doing and not just keep going for the sake of going, but actually look at how you're affecting your community or your collective and change and be flexible, which also is also the next point. Be as flexible as possible because things change often. Like sometimes there'll be 5 folks at the park and sometimes there'll be 30. But you have to be able to work with what is given and what is in front of you.
Yep. Clear boundaries, right? We talked about a lot. Setting clear boundaries for yourself with and for the people within the collective, and then having non-punitive strategies, right, to address things. So typically, punishment and accountability is seen through like punitive structures, through punishment. But it's understanding that it should be through healing and growth and care. No matter the harm that is caused, it's understanding that we don't want to have punitive responses to the shit anymore. That's what we're trained to have. So whether it's parenting, whether it's interpersonal relationships, whether it's with a random person you come across on the street, it's having non-punitive responses to things that you experience. And really like living your abolitionist politic and not just saying in your bio that you're an abolitionist, right? Because what the fuck does that mean? Who does that materially benefit if you're not practicing it in your everyday life? We can go to the next one. Appreciate it. Addressing conflict and difficult decisions. So making a worst case scenario plan. Again, if you pull up to the tracks, I said one specific location that we do. If you pull up to distro with your homies, and right, there's a sweep happening, right? Worst case scenario plan, right? Understanding what happens when a sweep is occurring when we're about to go serve with our homies. Have clarity on behaviors, patterns, and trigger responses that have harmed people in the past. Again, right, being aware of certain people's triggers, right, and things that caused them harm in the past that could cause them harm again if you reenact that behavior, even as innocent as you feel as it was, right? It can cause a trigger to anybody. Learning how to give real apologies, that's a struggle.
Do your research before the shit hits the fan.
Each member of your team is a whole fucking person, right? And they can show up as a whole fucking person however they want to show up.
Madness is not an excuse for abusive behavior. And that is so fucking key because it doesn't matter who the fuck you are. Madness is not an excuse for abusive behavior. Again, say it like 7 more times because it's so easy to let that type of thing go, specifically because we don't know how to handle madness and we don't talk about these things. We don't talk about disability justice. So we pretend like we can just look past it. But once we do start talking about it, which we all are now, you cannot look past it. You cannot pretend that those things are okay just because you don't know how to facilitate a real conversation about it.
Yeah, it's also about moving past identity reductionism, right? Or like just because that person is mentally ill, they can't cause harm. Or just because fucking Kamala Harris is a black and a woman, she's a fucking good candidate. Like that's identity reductionism. There's no material truth that addresses the reality of that situation, right? So like none of that shit is an excuse to cause harm, to hurt people, to destroy organizations, not like to be a fucking Zionist colonizer. Like none of that is an excuse, right? Just your identity reduced down to something, it doesn't matter. But an identity politic, right, is a lot different. So I think we have to be able to talk about the difference of those two. Extend compassion whenever possible, which you have to be in community to learn how to develop compassion.
Practice gratitude and appreciation, which
we
constantly don't do in our society because we're fast-paced and everything is about satisfaction, but it's so necessary, especially when working in a collective and trying to build a collective of beings who respect and reciprocate love to each other. Reminding people that they matter and that what they do is seen and cared for is so important.
I can't even like stress it enough. Like if someone does something for you and you just like or something like happens within your collective, like there's like a beautiful and like no one acknowledges it, that's shitty. Like just like tell people thank you, tell people you love them, give them a shout out for holding it down. Like constantly be complimenting your comrades and your homies, and like have that affinity with one another, because like you don't just want a space that like is always uncomfortable or always high stress, because we think that shit is normal, but it's not normal. And understanding that transformation takes time. On your path towards creating a care team, on your path towards becoming an abolitionist, whatever, right? On your path of political growth, of personal growth, of community growth, right? It's gonna take time, and harm is gonna occur, and there's gonna be struggle and there will be pain. But again, it's like having these frameworks in place so we can address it meaningfully and grow afterwards, right? And not take steps backwards. So we can go to the next one. I think it might be, yeah. So sorry we fucking talked the whole time. It's a lot to get through. We typically like in our comrades classroom, we try to have it more conversational. But there's like just a lot of shit that we had to like throw at you. But if there, what time is it? Yeah, I don't know how much time there is, but like definitely these questions are super important, but we don't obviously have to sit here and talk about them. Whatever y'all are feeling.
We have time for sure. So
yeah. Yeah, so I'm gonna let y'all kind of sit with these 3 questions then. What does it mean to you now to center the agency and self-determination of disabled and non-disabled folks? Right, so like making decisions based off of their needs, their agency, what they want for themselves, not what the medical industrial complex put onto them. Are there any specific aspects within disability and healing justice frameworks that seem challenging to you to implement in your daily life, in your collective life? And then do you have any questions for us? So any of those things y'all can hit, or we can call it quits, whatever y'all want.
And I know my memory is getting shorter by the minute. Tipping over bottles every second that I finish. The mirror keeps telling me shit I don't wanna hear. I seen the brasserie and shed a tear.